Hey guys, tonight we're not going to romanticize the fall of Rome. We're not going to spin tales of heroic last stands against overwhelming odds, or even dwell on the grandeur that was lost. Oh no. Tonight, we're going to pull back the velvet curtain of popular history and confront the raw, unvarnished, often deeply uncomfortable reality of the brutal truth about the Roman Empire's collapse. Boring history for sleep. You probably think of it as a singular event, a dramatic barbarian invasion. And while that's certainly part of the picture, tonight, you're going to feel the multi-layered, agonizing demise of what was once the greatest power on Earth. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're out there somewhere in the quiet hum of your own corner of the world, let us know where you're listening from. Perhaps you're nestled in a cozy apartment in New York City, or maybe drifting off in a peaceful cottage in rural England. Wherever you are, just relax. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the windswept, often desolate frontiers of the Roman Empire, perhaps along the Rhine or the Danube River. The air is cold, and you can almost feel the tension in the atmosphere, a constant, low thrum of impending danger. For centuries, Rome had been an expanding power, its legions pushing outwards, absorbing new territories, new peoples, and vast wealth. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, that dynamic has fundamentally shifted. The once mighty Roman military is no longer primarily an engine of conquest. It is now a sprawling, overstretched defensive line, constantly battling against relentless, overwhelming pressure. Welcome to the grim reality of invaders at the gates. You feel the crushing, relentless barbarian pressure. Imagine yourself as a Roman farmer living near the frontier. Your life is tied to the land, to the rhythm of the seasons. But now, that rhythm is constantly disrupted by the terrifying specter of barbarian raids. These aren't just small bands of opportunistic raiders looking for quick plunder. These are increasingly larger, more organized tribal confederations. The Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Alemanni, pushed from their homelands by various factors, perhaps internal conflicts, population pressures, or the terrifying arrival of the Huns further east. You hear their names whispered with fear, their presence a constant, chilling threat on the horizon. The Roman Empire, once unified and relatively cohesive, finds itself fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. From the misty forests of Britannia to the deserts of North Africa, from the vast plains of Gaul to the eastern borders with Persia, legions are stretched thin, desperately trying to hold the line. You see them, the weary soldiers, often recruited from the very frontier peoples they are now fighting against, their faces grim, their numbers dwindling. The brutal truth is that Rome simply doesn't have enough men, enough resources, or enough strategic flexibility to adequately defend its vast perimeter. It's like trying to plug 1,000 leaks in a giant, crumbling dam with only a handful of fingers. Consider the sheer scale of the movements. These aren't just military incursions. These are often entire peoples migrating, driven by desperation or opportunity. Imagine tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of men, women, and children, with their livestock and possessions, moving towards Roman territory. When the Visigoths famously sought refuge within the empire's borders in 376 CE, fleeing the Huns, it wasn't a handful of refugees. It was a nation knocking on the door. Rome. In a desperate attempt to manage the situation, granted them entry, but the mismanagement, the corruption of Roman officials, a theme we'll revisit later, and the brutal exploitation of these new arrivals quickly led to rebellion. You feel the deep resentment, the boiling anger that transforms desperate refugees into formidable enemies. This ultimately culminated in the devastating Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE. Imagine the raw terror as news trickles back to Rome. Emperor Valens, commanding a massive Roman army, has been utterly annihilated by the Visigoths, It's not just a defeat, it's a catastrophic rout, a humiliation on an unprecedented scale. The emperor himself is killed, perhaps burned alive in a farmhouse. His body never found. This isn't just a military setback, it's a profound psychological blow, shattering the myth of Roman invincibility. You feel the cold dread of realizing that the legions, once masters of the battlefield, can be utterly destroyed. A little-known detail from Adrianople is that the Roman cavalry was drawn away early in the battle, leaving the infantry vulnerable and allowing the Gothic cavalry to encircle and decimate them. The horror continues. The sack of Rome by Alaric's Visigoths in 410 CE was another brutal turning point. Imagine the unthinkable, the Eternal City, untouched by foreign enemies for nearly 800 years, breached and plundered. While it wasn't a complete razing of the city, the psychological impact was profound. You would huddle in fear, listening to the sounds of looting and terror, knowing that the very heart of your civilization had been violated. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a spiritual wound, shattering the illusion of eternal security. The Vandals, another formidable barbarian group, later crossed into North Africa, Rome's breadbasket, and established a powerful kingdom there, even building a navy that would eventually sack Rome in 455 CE. Imagine the sheer audacity, a barbarian kingdom not just on your land, but on your sea, threatening the very source of your food supply. This relentless pressure, from all directions, constantly sapped Rome's resources, depleted its manpower, and spread a pervasive sense of fear and instability. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the brutal truth of the invaders at the gates settle over you. It wasn't a single, dramatic assault, but a multi-century grind, a constant, horrifying pressure from outside that slowly but relentlessly chipped away at the empire's strength, resources, and morale. You feel the ghostly chill of barbarian war cries, the despair of a lost battle, and the profound terror of knowing that the very borders meant to protect you were perpetually under siege. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That the very force of expansion eventually became the relentless pressure of destruction. You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsettling echo of barbarian war cries, perhaps feeling a phantom chill from the windswept frontiers of the Roman Empire. We've explored the relentless external pressure that gnawed at Rome's borders. Now, let's turn our gaze inwards, to the very heart of the imperial system, and witness a horror that was just as, if not more, destructive empire's broken spine. You witness political chaos and constant assassinations. Imagine yourself as a Roman citizen living in the capital, or in one of the major cities like Antioch or Milan. Your world is supposedly governed by an emperor, a single, powerful figure who embodies the stability and might of Rome. But as the centuries progress, particularly from the early 3rd century CE onwards, that stable image shatters into 1,000 pieces. You are about to witness a terrifying, dizzying carousel of power, where emperors rise and fall with bewildering speed, often at the hands of their own soldiers. This period, famously known as the crisis of the 3rd century, is a brutal truth that belies any notion of imperial stability. From 235 CE to 284 CE, a mere 49 years, you count approximately 26 legitimate emperors, not to mention countless more usurpers, pretenders, and would-be rulers who seized power for a few months or even weeks before being overthrown. Imagine trying to keep track. It's like watching a deadly, high-stakes game of musical chairs. But the music never really stops. And the stakes are your life and the very fabric of the empire. You might find yourself joking grimly with your neighbors. Who's emperor today? Then, a dark humor born of sheer desperation and absurdity. Each new emperor, more often than not, is a successful general, proclaimed by his legions in some far-flung corner of the empire. Their loyalty is to him, the dispenser of pay and plunder. not necessarily to the abstract concept of Rome or the continuity of succession. This creates a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. A general wins a battle. His troops declare him emperor. He marches on the current imperial residence, often not Rome itself, but strategically located cities like Nicomedia or Trier, overthrows the existing emperor, and then himself becomes immediately vulnerable to the next ambitious general. You witness this tragic pattern repeating itself, endlessly, draining the empire of its strength. The consequences of this constant political chaos are utterly devastating. First and foremost, vast amounts of manpower, money, and resources that should be defending the empire's borders against those barbarians we just discussed are instead diverted to fighting bloody civil wars. Legions that should be repelling Goths on the Rhine are marching against other Roman legions in Italy or Gaul. You see this internal conflict firsthand. Once prosperous regions are ravaged by warring armies. Farms are laid waste. Trade routes are disrupted, and cities are plundered. Your roads, once arteries of commerce and communication, now serve primarily as military highways for rival factions. Historians still debate whether the crisis of the 3rd century was primarily a military crisis, an economic crisis, or a political crisis. But the general consensus is that it was a catastrophic convergence of all three, creating a feedback loop of decline where each factor exacerbated the others. Beyond the sheer waste of war, there's the utter paralysis of governance, with emperors lasting only a year or two on average. There's no time for long-term planning, no consistency in policy. You might see a new tax implemented one year, only to be abolished by the next emperor, or a crucial reform initiated only to be abandoned. The bureaucracy, already sprawling and inefficient, becomes even more confused and demoralized. Who do you follow? Whose orders are legitimate? It's a state of constant uncertainty, where strategic decisions for the empire's future are almost impossible to make. You feel this instability in your bones, in the pervasive sense of insecurity, in the constant fear of arbitrary changes from a distant, transient ruler. A little-known detail from this period is the extreme debasement of the Roman coinage. Desperate emperors, needing to pay their ever-demanding legions, would drastically reduce the silver content of coins, leading to rampant inflation and economic chaos, which further fueled unrest. Moreover, the best and brightest minds, the most capable generals and administrators, are often victims of this relentless instability. If you are a talented young officer or an astute civil servant, you face a brutal choice: stay loyal to an emperor who might be overthrown tomorrow, risking your life in the inevitable purge, or throw your lot in with a promising usurper, hoping to rise with him. The empire loses its most capable people to purges, assassinations, and the sheer exhaustion of perpetual conflict. It's a brain drain on an imperial scale, leaving the reins of power in the hands of those who are either ruthless, lucky, or simply desperate to survive. Imagine the psychological toll this takes on you. The Roman citizen, the emperor, once a symbol of stability, divine favor, and the enduring power of Rome, is now a transient figure, often a crude, uncultured soldier, who might not even visit the capital before being unceremoniously deposed. Your faith in the central authority erodes. You start to look to local strongmen, to regional warlords, or even to the nearest military commander for protection and stability, because the distant emperor seems increasingly irrelevant or impotent. This further fragments the empire, laying the groundwork for the independent kingdoms that will eventually emerge in the West. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the brutal truth of the empire's broken spine settle over you. It wasn't just barbarians at the gates, it was the empire devouring itself from within, tearing itself apart in a never-ending cycle of political chaos and assassinations. You feel the ghostly tremors of constant coups, the despair of a fractured state, and the chilling realization that the very leaders meant to guide Rome were often its most destructive force. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That internal strife could be just as devastating as any external enemy? You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsettling echo of Rome's broken spine and its dizzying carousel of emperors. Perhaps feeling a phantom chill from a general's opportunistic coup, we've explored the relentless external pressures and the devastating internal political chaos. Now, let's shift our attention to a quieter, more insidious killer that gnawed at the very sinews of your empire, silently eroding its strength from within economic chains. Not gold. You clutch your worthless coins, feeling the system fray. Imagine yourself as a busy merchant in Ostia, Rome's bustling port city, or perhaps a diligent farmer in a fertile province like Sicily or Egypt. For centuries, your life was intertwined with a vast, thriving economy, where goods flowed freely across the empire. Coinage was stable, and prosperity seemed boundless. The Roman economy was a marvel of the ancient world, driven by trade, agriculture, and the constant flow of wealth generated by conquest. But now, you begin to notice a troubling slowdown. The market feels less vibrant, the ships in the harbor less frequent, and a creeping anxiety about money starts to permeate daily life. The most visible symptom of this economic malaise is inflation, a silent thief that gradually steals the value of your money. Remember that conveyor belt of emperors we talked about, each new, desperate ruler, needing to pay his ever-demanding legions and secure his power, would often resort to a horrifying practice debasement of the currency. They'd simply mix less precious metal, gold, or silver into the coins, replacing it with cheaper, base metals like copper or lead. You'd receive a coin that looked the same, felt the same, but secretly contained far less real value. It's like being paid with a chocolate bar that gets smaller and smaller each week, even though the wrapper is identical. Historians still debate the precise mechanisms and exact timeline of Roman currency debasement, but its catastrophic impact on economic stability is undeniable. Some argue it was a desperate, if necessary, evil to fund endless wars and bribes. Others see it as a fundamental betrayal of trust that irrevocably damaged the Roman economic system. You see the immediate effect in the marketplace. Prices for basic goods, bread, olive oil, wool, begin to skyrocket. You might bring a handful of coins to the market that yesterday bought a week's food, and today they barely cover a single meal. This rampant inflation makes long-term planning impossible. Why save money when its value is constantly eroding? Why invest in a business when the costs of raw materials might double overnight? The incentive to produce and trade diminishes, leading to widespread economic stagnation. You might find yourself switching to bartering, exchanging goods directly, because you simply don't trust the imperial currency anymore. The very coin in your hand feels like a lie. Compounding this, the very arteries of trade, the vast network of Roman roads and sea lanes, are becoming increasingly dangerous. With barbarian incursions on the frontiers, remember them, and civil wars tearing through the interior. Bandits, renegade soldiers, and pirates make travel perilous. You might hesitate to send your valuable goods across long distances, fearing they will be seized or destroyed. The cost of security rises dramatically, making legitimate trade less profitable. Imagine being a merchant trying to bring wine from Italy to Gaul. You now have to factor in the very real risk of your convoy being ambushed on the roads, or your ship raided by pirates in the Mediterranean. This pervasive fear stifles commerce, pushing economic activity inwards, towards localized, self-sufficient communities rather than a vibrant, interconnected imperial economy. Then there's the changing nature of labor. The Roman Empire, for centuries, had relied heavily on slavery, fueled by conquest. But as expansion halted, and even reversed, the steady supply of new slaves dwindled. This, combined with the devastating effects of plagues that wiped out large portions of the population, a chilling callback to our previous discussion about Rome's horrors, led to severe labor shortages. You might be a wealthy landowner, finding it increasingly difficult to find enough workers to till your fields, or a craftsman struggling to find apprentices. This shortage drives up the cost of labor, further squeezing profits and impacting agricultural output. It's a vicious cycle where a lack of human bodies directly impacted the empire's ability to feed itself. A particularly insidious economic trend was the increasing autarky, or self-sufficiency, of large rural estates known as latifundia. Faced with unreliable central authority, dangerous trade routes, and debased currency, wealthy landowners began to produce everything they needed on their own vast estates: food, clothing, tools, even arms for their own private guards. They became miniature, self-contained economies, largely independent of the imperial market. You, as a peasant, might find yourself increasingly tied to such an estate, becoming a colonus, a tenant farmer who was essentially bound to the land. This system, while providing local stability, fundamentally undermined the imperial economy. It meant less trade between regions, less tax revenue for the central government, and a weaker, less dynamic urban economy. It's like the vast circulatory system of the empire slowly shutting down, as blood pools in isolated, self-contained organs. A little-known detail illustrating this shift is that by the late empire, many cities experienced significant depopulation, as people abandoned urban centers to seek security and sustenance on these large rural estates, further eroding the tax base and commercial vibrancy. The empire, desperate for revenue to pay its legions and maintain its ever-shrinking borders, resorted to ever more oppressive taxation. You, the ordinary citizen, would feel this burden acutely. Taxes were not just on land or produce, but on inheritances, sales, and even daily transactions. The system became less about fostering prosperity and more about extracting wealth to prop up a failing military and bureaucracy. This oppressive taxation, combined with rampant inflation and widespread economic stagnation, created a downward spiral. People had less incentive to work hard or produce surplus. Knowing that much of it would be taken by the state, this bred resentment, fueling civil unrest and contributing to the feeling that Rome was no longer working for its people. So, while not as dramatic as a barbarian invasion or an imperial assassination, the erosion of the Roman economy was a profound, slow-motion disaster. It starved the central government of the resources it needed, fragmented the vast imperial market, and ultimately undermined the prosperity and stability that had been the hallmark of Rome's greatest periods. You feel the weight of these economic chains, tightening slowly but inexorably around the empire's neck, not made of gold, but of dwindling trust, broken trade, and worthless coin. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That the very foundations of your wealth could simply evaporate, leaving you adrift in an empire that can no longer afford to be an empire? You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsettling echo of Rome's economic chains, perhaps feeling a phantom tightness in your imaginary purse. We've explored the relentless external pressures, the devastating internal political chaos, and the insidious economic decay that gnawed at the empire's foundations. Now, let's confront an enemy far more pervasive, more insidious, and utterly terrifying in its silent, sweeping devastation, disease's silent scythe. You feel the chilling grip of unseen, ancient plagues. Imagine yourself living in the bustling, often crowded cities of the Roman Empire, perhaps Rome itself, or a vibrant provincial capital like Antioch or Alexandria. You're surrounded by people, the vibrant hum of human activity filling the air. But this close proximity, this very vitality of urban life, also made you incredibly vulnerable to an unseen enemy. There were no microscopes, no germ theory, no understanding of how diseases truly spread. You attributed illness to divine wrath, to bad air miasma, or to some mysterious imbalance of humors. And then, the first person coughs, or a rash appears. You witness it begins subtly. A few isolated cases of fever, perhaps a persistent cough, or an inexplicable weakness. Then, it spreads, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. The streets, once bustling, become eerily quiet. Shops close, public spaces empty, and the familiar sounds of daily life are replaced by the grim sounds of retching, labored breathing, and the mournful wails of the bereaved. This isn't just a few isolated deaths. This is a true epidemic, a demographic catastrophe that sweeps through your city, claiming lives with horrifying indifference. The Roman Empire was repeatedly ravaged by devastating pandemics. The Antonine Plague 165 to 180 CE, which some historians believe was an outbreak of smallpox or measles, swept through the empire like wildfire. Imagine being a soldier returning from campaigns in the East, bringing with you not just spoils of war, but also an invisible killer. The disease would have spread rapidly along the very trade routes and military roads that were once symbols of Roman strength and connectivity. You hear whispers of entire legions being decimated, of cities losing a quarter, a third, or even half of their population. This isn't just a few isolated deaths. This is a demographic catastrophe that fundamentally weakened the empire for generations. Then came the plague of Cyprian 250-262 CE, likely a viral hemorrhagic fever, which struck during the chaotic crisis of the 3rd century. Remember those revolving emperors? This plague was even more virulent, killing thousands daily in Rome at its peak. Imagine the sheer terror of walking through streets where bodies lay unburied, where every cough was a death knell, and where even priests and healers succumbed. Historians still debate the exact mortality rates of these ancient plagues and their precise impact on the Roman population and economy, as precise figures are hard to ascertain. However, there's little doubt they caused widespread depopulation, massive labor shortages, and immense social disruption. Some scholars estimate that the Antonine Plague alone may have killed 5 to 10 million people across the empire, a staggering number for the time. The chilling thing is, you have no real understanding of the pathogen. You attribute the plague to divine wrath, to malevolent spirits, or to foul miasma. You desperately try remedies that are utterly ineffective, relying on prayers, sacrifices, and primitive medicine. Imagine the desperation, the fear that permeates every household. You watch helplessly as your neighbors, your family members, succumb one by one. The social fabric begins to unravel. People flee cities, abandoning their homes and businesses, further disrupting economic life and agricultural output. The impact on your military is particularly horrifying. Remember those stretched legions on the frontiers and those fighting civil wars? Now imagine them being ravaged by disease. Entire units are wiped out, not by barbarian swords, but by an unseen enemy. This significantly weakens Rome's ability to defend its vast borders, making it even more vulnerable to those migrating tribes we talked about earlier. A legion that lost 30% or 50% of its strength to plague would be utterly ineffective against a determined barbarian force. This compounding factor, internal disease weakening defenses against external threats, creates a terrifying domino effect that accelerates the empire's decline. A little-known detail from the plague of Cyprian is that it occurred concurrently with a period of severe barbarian invasions and internal strife, suggesting a deadly synergy between the three factors in weakening the empire. Beyond the immediate death toll, these plagues have profound psychological and social effects. You witness a deep sense of despair, fatalism, and disillusionment. Why bother building or striving when a silent killer can take everything away in an instant? This period of widespread death and suffering also contributed significantly to the rise of new religious movements, particularly Christianity. In a world where traditional gods seemed powerless against disease, the promise of salvation and an afterlife offered by Christianity resonated deeply with a terrified populace, providing solace and meaning in the face of such overwhelming loss. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the chilling grip of ancient epidemics settle upon you. From the terrifying sweep of the Antonine and Cyprian plagues to the constant, unseen microbial threats of daily life, disease was a pervasive and often horrifying killer in ancient Rome. You feel the ghostly shiver of fever, the gnawing ache of illness, and the profound vulnerability of a body without the shield of modern medicine. It's a sobering thought, isn't it, that an invisible enemy, smaller than the eye could see, could bring even the mightiest empire to its knees. You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsettling echo of disease's silent scythe, perhaps feeling a phantom chill from an ancient Roman fever. We've explored the relentless external pressures, the devastating internal political chaos, the insidious economic decay, and the chilling grip of ancient plagues. Now, let's turn our attention to the very institution that built Rome's glory and guarded its vast frontiers, but which, paradoxically, became a major contributor to its demise. A military's shifting loyalty. You watch as your protectors turn their deadly gaze inward. Imagine yourself a Roman citizen living near a legionary camp, or perhaps in a bustling provincial city like Trier or Constantinople. For centuries, the sight of the eagles, the disciplined march of the cohorts, filled you with an unparalleled sense of security, of invincible strength. The Roman army was the most formidable fighting force the world had ever seen, a highly trained, well-equipped machine that had carved out an empire from scratch. But now, in the later centuries of the empire, something fundamental has changed. The uniform is the same, the outward discipline still present, but the spirit, the very essence of its allegiance, has begun to fragment and fracture. We briefly touched upon the crisis of the 3rd century, that dizzying carousel of emperors. Well, the legions were not just observers in that bloody drama. They were the primary actors, the kingmakers. When an emperor displeased them, when their pay was delayed, or when a popular general promised greater rewards, the legions didn't hesitate to rebel, to march on the capital, and to install their own man on the throne. You see this happen again and again, a terrifying pattern repeating itself. Each successful usurpation sets a precedent, teaching other legions that power flows from the sword, not from Rome, not from the Senate, and certainly not from any grand, abstract idea of the empire. This constant involvement in internal power struggles had devastating effects on the army's primary mission defending the empire. Legions were routinely pulled from the frontiers, leaving vast stretches of the border vulnerable to those barbarian migrations we discussed earlier. Imagine being a commanding officer on the Rhine, constantly having to look over your shoulder, wondering if you should be preparing to fight a Gothic raiding party or a rival Roman army marching from Italy. Your focus shifts from external threats to internal politics, a fatal distraction for any military force. Historians still debate whether the Roman army's decline was primarily due to a decrease in fighting ability or simply an overwhelming number of internal and external threats. While individual units often fought bravely and effectively, the strategic coherence and overall readiness of the military suffered immensely due to this constant internal strife. The composition of the army itself began to change dramatically. Remember how it transitioned from citizen soldiers to a professional force? That evolution continued, as the pool of Roman citizens willing or able to serve diminished, and as the empire needed more and more manpower. It increasingly relied on recruiting barbarians, Germanic tribesmen, Goths, Franks, who were granted citizenship or allowed to serve as foederati allies in exchange for land or pay. You might see a unit composed almost entirely of men who speak Latin with a heavy accent, who worship different gods, and whose primary loyalty is to their own chieftain or to the general who enlisted them. This isn't necessarily a bad thing in itself. These barbarian soldiers were often fierce and effective fighters, bringing new tactics and strength. But it altered the fundamental character of the Roman army. Their loyalty was often personal, to their commander, rather than institutional, to the Roman state. If that commander decided to rebel, his largely non-Roman troops would likely follow him, regardless of imperial legitimacy. A little-known detail is that by the late Roman Empire, many high-ranking generals, even those who held immense power and protected Rome, were themselves of Germanic descent, like Stilicho or Ricimer. These men effectively controlled the empire through their military might, embodying the shifting allegiances within the command structure itself. You witness these powerful figures, almost kings in their own right, pulling the strings from behind the imperial facade. Furthermore, the quality of training and equipment began to decline in some areas, with constant warfare and economic strain. Remember those economic chains? Resources were stretched thin. You might see soldiers equipped with less effective armor, or trained less rigorously than their predecessors. The legendary Roman discipline, while still present in some elite units, began to fray in others, particularly those focused on internal power struggles rather than external defense. This unevenness in quality meant that while some legions remained formidable, others were less capable of standing against determined invaders. The glorious image of the Roman legionary, once the epitome of military perfection, became tarnished by necessity, neglect, and the internal focus. The army's ever-increasing demands for pay, resources, and often political influence also put immense strain on the already struggling imperial economy. Remember those economic chains, a significant portion of the empire's revenue, already depleted by inflation and a shrinking tax base, was funneled directly to the military. This created a vicious cycle. The empire needed the army to defend itself, but paying the army bled the empire dry, making it weaker and thus more reliant on the army. You feel this burden directly through increased taxes and requisitions, often levied without mercy. The military wasn't just a defensive force. It became a pervasive presence in civilian life. You might see soldiers acting as tax collectors, or involved in local administration, blurring the lines between military and civilian authority. While this provided some local order in a chaotic world, it also meant that military force was often the direct face of imperial power, rather than the more nuanced system of law and governance. You're living in an increasingly militarized society, where the will of the legions often takes precedence over established legal processes, and justice is frequently dispensed by the sword, not the scales. So, the army, Rome's greatest strength, paradoxically became a major contributor to its brutal downfall. Its internal power struggles fractured the state, its changing composition shifted loyalties, and its insatiable demands drained the imperial coffers. You realize that your protectors, the very men who guaranteed the Pax Romana, had become a force of instability. Their gaze turned inward, their loyalty fragmented. It's a truly brutal irony. The hand that built the empire was also the hand that, inadvertently, helped to tear it apart from within. You can almost feel the tremor of those legions marching, not against a foreign foe, but against Rome itself, in a terrifying, self-destructive dance. You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsettling echo of the Roman military's shifting loyalties, perhaps feeling a phantom chill from an unholy alliance. We've explored the relentless external pressures, the devastating internal political chaos, the insidious economic decay, the chilling grip of ancient plagues, and the army's brutal turning inward. Now, let's consider the literal foundations of Roman power, the very structures that defined its civilization, and witness their slow, horrifying deterioration, infrastructure's slow decay. You navigate crumbling roads, notice broken aqueducts. Imagine yourself a traveler in the Roman Empire, perhaps a merchant moving goods, a soldier on duty, or simply a citizen visiting relatives in another province. For centuries, Rome was famous for its unparalleled infrastructure. You would travel on magnificent paved roads, straight as an arrow, stretching for thousands of miles across vast territories. You would see majestic aqueducts bringing fresh, clean water to cities, and grand public buildings like bathhouses, forums, and temples that showcased Roman engineering genius. This infrastructure wasn't just convenient, it was a physical manifestation of Rome's power, its order, and its ability to connect and govern a vast empire. But as the empire began its long, brutal decline, so too did its once glorious infrastructure. You begin to notice the subtle signs first. A pothole on a once perfect road. a section of an aqueduct that looks a little less well-maintained. Then, the deterioration accelerates. Roads, once meticulously cared for, become riddled with cracks, broken paving stones, and deep ruts. Travel becomes slower, more arduous, and far more dangerous. Imagine trying to transport heavy goods or march an army over roads that are constantly falling apart. This isn't just an inconvenience. It's a direct impediment to trade, communication, and military movement. The very arteries that sustained the empire begin to harden and clog. Historians still debate the precise period and regional variations of Roman infrastructural decline, but it's clear that while the East maintained much of its infrastructure, the West saw a significant deterioration from the 4th century onwards, mirroring its broader collapse. The reasons for this decay are tied directly to the brutal truths we've already explored. Remember the economic chains. Maintaining such a vast network of roads, bridges, and aqueducts required immense, continuous investment of money and labor. As the imperial treasury dwindled due to inflation and a shrinking tax base, and as manpower was diverted to endless wars and defending against barbarian invaders, funds for maintenance simply dried up. You might be a local magistrate desperately trying to fix a vital bridge, but the imperial coffers are empty, and the central government has bigger problems, like figuring out who the next emperor will be, or fighting off the latest barbarian incursion. It's like watching a colossal machine rust away because no one can afford the oil or the mechanics anymore. A little-known detail is that local communities sometimes resorted to reusing building materials from abandoned villas or public structures to repair roads or defenses, a stark indicator of resource scarcity and the breakdown of centralized maintenance. Then there are the aqueducts. These engineering marvels, bringing fresh water to millions, were incredibly complex systems requiring constant supervision, cleaning, and repair. You rely on them for drinking water, for public baths, and for sanitation. But as the imperial administration weakens, as engineers and laborers are no longer trained or available, these systems begin to fail. Imagine the horror of a major aqueduct breaking, cutting off water to a large city. Disease, remember, those silent scythes would quickly spread through a population reliant on contaminated well water. Public baths, once a symbol of Roman civilization and hygiene, would close, further exacerbating public health crises. The very symbol of Roman cleanliness and organization slowly turns into a source of illness and despair. Beyond roads and aqueducts, other critical infrastructure also suffered. Bridges would collapse, harbors would silt up, and public buildings would fall into disrepair, becoming quarries for new constructions rather than maintained structures. Cities, once vibrant centers of trade and administration, would become smaller, less organized, and less capable of sustaining their populations. You might see the Grand Forum, once a bustling hub, slowly being overtaken by weeds. Its marble columns toppled. This physical decay was a chilling reflection of the empire's internal collapse. The barbarian invasions also played a direct role in infrastructure destruction. Invaders often targeted bridges, roads, and aqueducts to impede Roman troop movements or to lay siege to cities. While some damage might be repaired, the continuous nature of these incursions meant that permanent, large-scale restoration became impossible. You might witness a vital bridge being deliberately destroyed, leaving your community isolated and vulnerable. This deliberate sabotage further fragmented the empire, making communication and centralized control even more difficult. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the brutal truth of infrastructure's slow decay in ancient Rome settle over you. The physical bonds that once held the vast empire together slowly frayed, not always with dramatic collapses, but with persistent neglect, economic starvation, and the relentless wear of time and conflict. You feel the ghostly rumble of a broken road beneath your feet, the unsettling silence of an unused aqueduct, and the profound vulnerability of a civilization losing its foundational strength. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That the very things designed to last forever could slowly, agonizingly, fall apart, taking an empire with them. You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsettling echo of Rome's decaying infrastructure, perhaps feeling a phantom bump from a broken road? We've explored the relentless external pressures, the devastating internal political chaos, the insidious economic decay, the chilling grip of ancient plagues, the army's brutal turning inward, and the slow collapse of the empire's physical bonds. Now, let's talk about a burden that pressed down on every single Roman citizen, a relentless demand from a state increasingly desperate to survive taxation's crushing burden. You feel the state's insatiable, debilitating demands. Imagine yourself as an ordinary Roman citizen, a farmer, a shopkeeper, a craftsman. Your life is already a struggle against the elements, against illness, against the uncertainty of war and politics. But on top of all this, you constantly feel the heavy hand of the imperial tax collector. For centuries, taxes were collected to fund the legions, maintain the infrastructure, and support the imperial court. But as the empire's problems mounted, the demands became ever more insatiable, transforming taxation from a necessary contribution into a truly crushing burden that squeezed the very life out of the populace. Remember that economic debasement we discussed, where coins lost their value? This didn't stop the state from demanding taxes. In fact, it often made it worse. If the value of your currency plummeted, the state might demand taxes in kind, meaning you had to surrender a portion of your actual harvest, your livestock, your manufactured goods. Imagine growing a field of wheat, working tirelessly all year, only for a significant portion of it to be seized by the imperial agent to feed a distant legion or a corrupt official. This direct requisition of your produce left you with less to feed your family, less to sell, and less incentive to produce a surplus. It's like having a bottomless pit in your backyard that demands more and more of your livelihood. Historians still debate the precise methods and efficiency of tax collection in the late Roman Empire, but there is a strong consensus that the system became increasingly burdensome and often arbitrary, leading to widespread discontent and evasion. The sheer frequency and variety of taxes were also horrifying. You might be paying a land tax, a poll tax on each person, a sales tax, a customs duty if you transported goods, and various other levies. Then, on top of that, came the annona, compulsory requisitions of grain or other supplies for the army. Imagine a sudden decree that you must provide a certain amount of wheat to feed a marching legion, even if your own granary is nearly empty. There was little recourse, little mercy. Failure to pay often meant severe punishment, public flogging, confiscation of property, or even forced labor. You lived in constant fear of the tax collector, knowing that his demands were paramount and your personal suffering was irrelevant. This heavy taxation, combined with the economic stagnation and inflation we've discussed, created a devastating feedback loop. People, especially small farmers and artisans, were simply unable to meet the ever-increasing demands. Many abandoned their land, fleeing to other regions or seeking the patronage of wealthy landowners, those latifundia we remembered earlier, who could offer some protection from the state's demands, often in exchange for becoming tied to their estate as a semi-free tenant colonist. This further reduced the state's tax base and manpower, as people became less visible to imperial authorities. You might even hear whispers of people actively trying to disappear, to vanish from the census rolls, hoping to escape the relentless squeeze of the state. A little-known detail is that the Roman state sometimes resorted to tying occupations to families, making it hereditary, to ensure that certain essential services or tax-paying professions couldn't be abandoned, further stripping away individual freedom in the name of imperial survival. The corruption within the tax collection system was also rampant and horrifying. Local officials, desperate to meet quotas imposed by the central government, often resorted to extortion and bribery. You might find yourself paying more than legally required, simply to avoid harassment or worse. This added another layer of injustice and resentment. Knowing that your hard-earned money was not just going to the state, but lining the pockets of corrupt officials, it eroded public trust in the government, making people less willing to support the very empire that was supposed to protect them. The sheer inequity was also brutal. While the wealthy elite often found ways to evade or lessen their tax burden through loopholes, bribery, or political influence, the burden fell disproportionately on the poor and middle classes. You, the small farmer or urban artisan, felt the full weight of the empire's financial desperation, while the rich continued to enjoy their luxuries. This widening gap between the taxed and the untaxed, the burdened and the privileged, created deep social unrest and resentment, further fracturing Roman society. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the brutal truth of taxation's crushing burden in ancient Rome settle over you. It wasn't just a financial levy, it was a relentless, debilitating force that squeezed the life out of ordinary citizens, driving them to destitution, abandonment of their lands, and even flight. You feel the ghostly weight of those heavy demands, the despair of a constantly emptying purse, and the profound injustice of a system that became increasingly parasitic. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That the very mechanism meant to sustain the empire became one of its most brutal instruments of self-destruction? You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsettling echo of Rome's crushing taxation, perhaps feeling a phantom weight in your imaginary pockets. We've explored the relentless external pressures, the devastating internal political chaos, the insidious economic decay, the chilling grip of ancient plagues, the army's brutal turning inward, the slow collapse of infrastructure, and the debilitating demands of the taxman. Now, let's turn to a less tangible, yet equally profound, and ultimately fracturing force that reshaped the very soul of the empire, the Great Divide of Faith. You witness Christianity's rise and internal fragmentation. Imagine yourself living in the Roman Empire during the 1st or 2nd century CE. Your world is a tapestry of polytheistic beliefs. You might worship Jupiter and Mars, honor your household gods, Lares and Penates, and even adopt deities from conquered lands. The empire, for the most part, was pragmatically tolerant of different cults, as long as they didn't directly threaten Roman authority or state religion, which involved honoring the emperor as a divine figure. It was a flexible system: add more gods, add more blessings. But then, a new belief system began to rise from the east, quiet at first, then growing with an unstoppable fervor: Christianity. You might first hear whispers about this new sect whose followers worshipped a single, crucified God, refused to offer sacrifices to the emperor or traditional Roman deities, and met in secret. Initially, you might dismiss them as eccentric, perhaps even dangerous. Roman authorities often viewed Christians with deep suspicion, seeing their monotheism and their refusal to participate in state cults as an act of defiance, leading to sporadic and often brutal persecutions. You might witness a Christian being dragged to the amphitheater, their unwavering faith in the face of agonizing death both perplexing and, for some, strangely compelling. This era of persecution, though horrifying, inadvertently strengthened the faith by creating martyrs whose sacrifices inspired others. But despite the brutal persecutions, Christianity continued to spread with astonishing speed, especially among the poor, the marginalized, slaves, and eventually, even segments of the elite. Why? Perhaps it was the promise of salvation and eternal life, the emphasis on charity, compassion, and community. Remember how the plague of Cyprian ravaged Rome. Christians often cared for the sick when others fled, or the idea of a universal brotherhood that resonated deeply in an increasingly uncertain and brutal world. You might find solace in its message, seeing it as an answer to the widespread despair and the harsh realities of Roman life. It offered a sense of belonging and meaning that traditional Roman paganism, with its often cold and transactional relationship with the gods, could not provide. The true turning point, however, comes in the 4th century. Imagine the shock, the bewilderment, the revolutionary change, when Emperor Constantine, after his victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, attributes his success to the Christian God. He then issues the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, granting religious toleration throughout the empire, effectively ending state-sponsored persecution of Christians. Suddenly, Christianity goes from being a persecuted sect to a favored religion, enjoying imperial patronage and rapidly gaining adherents and power. Then, later in the same century, Emperor Theodosius III makes Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire, eventually suppressing pagan cults. This monumental shift, while seemingly a unifying force, inadvertently created a new set of deep internal divisions within the empire. You, if you were a devout pagan, would feel your traditional gods and practices being marginalized, even suppressed. Temples might be closed, ancient festivals curtailed, and your very way of life challenged. It's a profound cultural and religious upheaval, forcing a choice of allegiance that wasn't previously necessary. Historians still debate the extent to which the rise of Christianity contributed to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Some influential scholars like Edward Gibbon argued that it diverted loyalty from the state to the church, fostered pacifism, and undermined traditional Roman civic virtues and military spirit. Others vehemently contend that it actually provided a new unifying moral and social force, offering cohesion and a framework for survival amidst chaos, and that its rise was a symptom, not a cause, of Rome's decline. The internal divisions within Christianity itself also played a brutal role. As it grew and spread, different interpretations of doctrine emerged, leading to fierce theological debates, heresies, and bitter schisms. You might find yourself caught in heated arguments about the nature of Christ, the Trinity, the role of saints, or the authority of bishops. These were not mere academic discussions. They were passionate, often violent disputes that tore communities apart, leading to riots, purges, and even imperial intervention. Emperors, attempting to unify the empire under one faith, would often try to enforce a single orthodox view, leading to further purges, exiles, and persecutions of Christian heretics by other Christians. This religious infighting, while not directly causing barbarian invasions, certainly diverted immense imperial resources and attention, exacerbating existing political and social fragmentation. A little-known detail is how extensively some emperors, like Justinian in the Eastern Roman Empire, became involved in theological minutiae, spending vast amounts of time and energy trying to reconcile warring Christian factions through councils and decrees, often to little lasting effect. Moreover, the rise of the church as a powerful, organized institution created a parallel power structure to the state. Bishops and patriarchs gained immense moral, social, and even political influence, sometimes effectively challenging or even replacing imperial authority, especially in the Western Empire where imperial power was rapidly weakening. You might see a local bishop acting as the de facto leader of a city during a barbarian siege, providing solace, organization, and even negotiating terms where the Roman government had fled or failed. This growing power of the church, while often providing vital services and continuity for local populations, symbolized a profound shift in the locus of loyalty and authority, away from the secular Roman state. So, the rise of Christianity, from a persecuted minority to the dominant faith, represents a monumental transformation within the Roman Empire, creating a great divide that reshaped its very soul. While it brought new unity and hope to many, it also engendered deep internal conflicts, shifted allegiances, and presented a powerful new institution that sometimes rivaled and ultimately outlasted the Roman state itself. You witness this profound shift, not just on maps showing east and west, but in the very hearts and minds of the people around you, a silent but profound reorientation that played a brutal, undeniable role in the empire's ultimate end. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That a spiritual revolution could contribute so fundamentally to the unraveling of a vast secular empire? You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsettling echo of faith's great divide, perhaps feeling a phantom tremor from an ancient theological debate. We've explored the relentless external pressures, the devastating internal political chaos, the insidious economic decay, the chilling grip of ancient plagues, the army's brutal turning inward, the slow collapse of infrastructure, and the debilitating demands of taxation, along with the profound shift in religious loyalties. Now, let's bring it to the very top, to the figures who held the reins of power, and often, through their own shortcomings and the impossible challenges they faced, accelerated the brutal demise leadership's fatal flaws. You glimpse emperors overwhelmed by impossible challenges. Imagine yourself as a Roman citizen, perhaps living in the imperial city of Ravenna, the Western Empire's later capital, or even the older, more symbolic Rome. You look to your emperor, the singular figurehead who is supposed to embody strength, wisdom, and the divine right to rule. For centuries, Rome had produced a string of effective, even brilliant, leaders, from Augustus, who established the Pax Romana, to Trajan, who expanded the empire to its greatest extent, to Hadrian, who solidified its borders. But by the later centuries of the Western Empire, the quality of leadership, often through no fault of their own, but due to the sheer impossibility of the circumstances, had deteriorated to a truly brutal degree. Remember the crisis of the 3rd century, that dizzying carousel of emperors. While some strong leaders like Diocletian and Constantine temporarily stemmed the tide, they also fundamentally altered the nature of the emperorship, making it more autocratic, more removed from the traditional Roman elite, and more reliant on military power. You witness a parade of short-lived emperors, often military men of undistinguished background, elevated to power by their legions, only to be assassinated or deposed within months or a few years. This constant political instability meant that even genuinely capable emperors rarely had the time or consistent support to implement long-term solutions to Rome's mounting problems. Imagine trying to solve a complex puzzle when the person in charge keeps changing every few months, each with a different idea of how to put it together, or simply focused on staying alive. Historians still debate the extent to which the quality of individual Roman emperors contributed to the decline, versus the overwhelming systemic problems they inherited. Some argue that truly strong leadership might have delayed the inevitable, while others contend that the challenges were simply too immense for any single individual to overcome. Beyond the rapid turnover, many of the later Western Roman emperors were simply not up to the impossible task. They were often young, weak, or inexperienced figures, chosen by powerful barbarian generals. Remember those shifting military loyalties who truly held the reins of power behind the throne. You might hear whispers in the streets about your emperor being a mere shadow of a ruler, a puppet controlled by his magister militum, master of soldiers. Imagine a vast, crumbling empire, under constant siege, run by child emperors or ineffective figureheads who lacked the personal charisma, military prowess, or political acumen to command respect or inspire loyalty. This isn't just poor leadership. It's a terrifying vacuum of power at the very top, leaving decisions to ambitious, self-interested strongmen. A little-known detail is that the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was famously a teenage boy, whose very name, Little Augustus, ironically underscored the diminishment of the imperial office. The division of the empire into East and West, initiated by Diocletian and solidified by Constantine, while intended to make the empire more governable, also created a new set of brutal leadership challenges. The Western Roman Empire, with its fewer resources, less defensible borders, and more decentralized wealth, often found itself at a disadvantage compared to the wealthier, more stable Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire. You might see a Western emperor desperately appealing to his Eastern counterpart for military or financial aid, only to be met with hesitation or outright refusal, as the East prioritized its own survival. This lack of cohesive imperial strategy, This internal bickering between two halves of what was once a single entity significantly hampered Rome's ability to present a united front against its myriad enemies. It's like trying to fight a war with two generals who constantly disagree and refuse to share resources. The imperial court itself often became a hotbed of intrigue, corruption, and factionalism. You might see powerful eunuchs, ambitious advisors, or jealous rivals constantly undermining each other, poisoning the atmosphere with mistrust and suspicion. This internal politicking diverted vital energy and attention away from the real problems facing the empire. Instead of focusing on barbarian incursions or economic reform, emperors and their advisors were often consumed by power struggles within the palace, fearing assassination more than invasion. Furthermore, the imperial cult, once a unifying force, had waned, replaced by the great divide of faith in Christianity. While Christianity brought a new moral framework, it also meant that emperors no longer commanded the same unquestioning, quasi-divine reverence from their subjects that earlier emperors enjoyed. This subtle erosion of spiritual authority, combined with the visible incompetence and rapid turnover of emperors, meant that leaders struggled to inspire the deep loyalty and shared purpose that Rome once commanded. You feel a growing cynicism, a sense of detachment from your leaders, seeing them as distant, often ineffective, figures rather than beacons of strength. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the brutal truth of leadership's fatal flaws in the Roman Empire settle over you. It wasn't just individual incompetence, but a systemic breakdown in imperial authority, fueled by rapid turnovers, puppet emperors, internal divisions, and the sheer impossibility of the challenges. You feel the ghostly burden of impossible decisions, the chilling isolation of supreme power, and the profound tragedy of leaders, often well-intentioned, ultimately overwhelmed by the forces of history. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That even at the very pinnacle of power, the empire found itself bereft of the consistent, decisive guidance it so desperately needed. You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsettling echo of leadership's fatal flaws, perhaps feeling a phantom sigh of exasperation from a long-lost Roman bureaucrat. We've explored the relentless external pressures, the devastating internal political chaos, the insidious economic decay, the chilling grip of ancient plagues, the army's brutal turning inward, the slow collapse of infrastructure, the debilitating demands of taxation, and the profound shift in religious loyalties, all exacerbated by the shortcomings of leadership. Now, as our journey through the brutal truth of the Roman Empire's collapse concludes, you are left to contemplate its ultimate reality. A long, brutal farewell. You contemplate the slow, agonizing end of an era. Imagine yourself as an ordinary Roman citizen living in the 5th century CE, particularly in the Western Empire. There is no single dramatic day when the Roman Empire falls in a sudden, catastrophic implosion. No grand final battle where the last legion lays down its arms. Instead, it is a prolonged, agonizing, and often confusing process of decline, decentralization, and transformation. You are living through a slow-motion unraveling, a brutal farewell that stretches over decades, perhaps even centuries. You witness the gradual withdrawal of Roman authority. The legions, once omnipresent, become fewer and further between, or simply melt away into local forces. Imperial governors and tax collectors become less visible, their power waning. In their place, new powers emerge: barbarian kings, powerful local landowners, or even the burgeoning authority of the Christian Church. You might find yourself living under the rule of a Germanic king, a Visigoth, a Vandal, or a Frank, who, while perhaps adopting some Roman customs, fundamentally operates outside the imperial system. This isn't a clean break. It's a messy, often violent, patchwork of new and old, slowly replacing what was once a unified whole. Consider the psychological toll of this drawn-out decline. For generations, your ancestors believed in the eternal city, in the perpetual might of Rome. Now, you see its symbols crumbling around you. Roads fall into disrepair. Remember that collapsing infrastructure? Trade dwindles. Those economic chains tighten, and cities shrink as people abandon urban centers for the perceived safety of self-sufficient rural estates. The grand public games become less frequent. The bathhouses close. And the forum, once a vibrant hub, slowly fills with rubble and vegetation. You live with a pervasive sense of nostalgia for a golden age you never knew. A feeling of loss for something that is slowly but irrevocably slipping away. Historians still debate whether the fall of the Western Roman Empire was truly a fall in the traditional sense, or more accurately, a transformation into the early medieval kingdoms. While it undeniably meant the end of centralized imperial authority in the West, many Roman legal, cultural, and administrative practices continued in various forms under the new Germanic rulers. The final official fall in 476 CE, when the child emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, was almost anticlimactic. You might hear the news weeks later, or not at all if you live in a remote area. Odoacer didn't even bother to crown himself emperor. He simply sent the imperial regalia back to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, effectively acknowledging that the Western throne was no longer viable. For many, it was simply a confirmation of a reality they had been living for a long time. The brutal truth was that the Western Empire had ceased to effectively exist as a unified, governed entity long before this symbolic date. A little-known detail is that the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to flourish for another 1,000 years, preserving much of Roman law, culture, and imperial traditions, effectively being the continuation of the Roman Empire, just centered in the East. This means Rome itself didn't truly vanish, but its western half underwent a profound, brutal, and lengthy transformation. This slow, agonizing demise meant that generations lived through continuous uncertainty and decline. Unlike a sudden disaster, which might prompt a unified response, the slow unraveling of Rome left people feeling isolated, abandoned, and increasingly reliant on local strongmen or the growing power of the church. The focus shifted from grand imperial projects to immediate, localized survival. You learn to fend for yourself, to negotiate with the local warlord, to rely on your community rather than a distant, ineffective emperor. This fragmented existence was a brutal contrast to the unified, ordered world Rome once promised. So, the brutal truth about Rome's collapse wasn't a single, horrifying reason, but a confluence of relentless external pressures, devastating internal conflicts, crippling economic burdens, pervasive disease, internal military strife, decaying infrastructure, crushing taxation, and a profound shift in societal values and leadership. Each factor fed into the others, creating a spiral of decline that lasted for centuries. It was a long, brutal farewell to an empire that was simply too vast, too complex, and ultimately, too internally fractured to withstand the relentless forces of change. You feel the ghostly weight of that slow, agonizing end, the chilling quiet that descends as an era finally, truly breathes its last.